Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support is greatly appreciated. Kindly like and share this audiobook to extend its reach, enabling more individuals to access its profound wisdom. Remember to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can propagate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, nurturing a community focused on enlightenment and inner serenity. We thank you for being a part of our mission to make these transformative teachings accessible to all. Let's commence today's reading. Responsible for your goodness. May 19, 2012. Each time you sit down to meditate, remind yourself that this is the most important thing you can be doing right now. It's the most important skill you can develop in your life. The ability to drop all your other concerns and focus on what really is your responsibility, which is the shape of your mind. It's so easy for us to talk about how we're responsible for things outside, and that is part of our goodness. But where does that goodness come from? If you're responsible for things outside and yet are doing a horrible job, creating suffering for yourself or suffering for other people, it's nothing to be proud of. You have to give precedence to the state of your mind so that you can take care of your responsibilities well. But the state of your mind isn't something that's going to be good on its own. It needs training. It needs nourishment, the proper kind of nourishment. All too often we nourish ourselves with thoughts of our own importance, or thoughts of sensuality, thoughts of who knows what. And that kind of food is not necessarily good for the mind, because often those thoughts can poison whatever goodness we may have. The Buddha gives an example of someone who's practicing concentration and starts thinking about how his concentration is better than other people's concentration. And that right there spoils it. This tendency doesn't apply only to concentration. It can apply to anything else you do in life. You do it well, but then you build up a lot of pride around it. It's like taking good nourishing food and then sprinkling arsenic or bits of rotten sh over the top. For the goodness of the mind really to be good, it has to come from within. From a sense of its own inner sciency, its own inner strength, its ability to nourish itself properly. And then whatever goodness it does outside will just naturally come. It's a natural expression of the mind. It's more likely to be right for the occasion and not harmful to anyone. So to really be responsible, you have to take responsibility for this, the state of your mind, right now, and your ability to protect it, look after it. That means you have to give it a lot of attention. It also means you have to be willing to put aside a lot of other connections in your life. When Luang Pu Thai was here these last couple of days, that was one of the things he repeated over and over again. Our need to be quiet, the need for restraint, the need to focus on what really is our responsibility, which is the shape of our mind. No one else can do this work for us. You see this when you're dealing with other people. People you love are suffering, and there's something in them that you can't reach, as when someone is really, really sick, or really miserable and really depressed, and yet you just can't reach them. Or someone is dying. You realize that if that person had taken care of his or her own mind, he or she wouldn't be suffering, and we would be suffering a lot less. We wouldn't be worried for them. Which means that one thing we can do now for the people who will be around us when we die is to develop skill in nourishing the state of our mind. So this is your number one responsibility, the shape of your mind right now. And the goodness of the mind is something that doesn't need to be decorated. It doesn't have to have a lot of pride or conceit or anything. You may need to develop a certain amount of pride or conceit as you're working on these skills, but as the skills get better and better, that pride and conceit are really unnecessary, and they get in the way. You can put them aside because the goodness of the mind in and of itself is its reward. So we focus on the breath to try to bring the mind to what the Buddha calls a state of seclusion. Put aside any unskillful thoughts that come up. Try not to get entangled with any concern that they're arising as a blemish on your ego. What the hell, they're here, but you don't have to get involved with them. They're going to come, but then they're going to go. You just don't have to get involved. And you learn how to pull away from them. It's not that you're in denial about them, it's just that you don't have to participate in whatever stories they want to get you involved in. You see them come and then you just watch them go. You've got a place to stand here with the breath, apart from them, so try to make the breath as comfortable as possible. This is your nourishment along the way to getting the mind in really good shape. This is the energy held in the body that allows the breath to come in, allows it to go out. It nourishes the nerves, nourishes the blood vessels, and allows the body to move. It's our most direct experience of the body, and yet we tend to look past it. We tend to see the solidity of the body as prior, and then wonder how we can get breath to go through the solidity. Actually, the breath is already there. As far as our awareness is concerned, the breath is primary. It comes RST. The reason why healthy breath energy is nourishing to the mind is because it's so near to the mind. It LLS your awareness of the body with a sense of comfortable energy. That energy becomes the medium through which you experience every other aspect of the body. When that sense of well-being nourishes the mind, you're in a much better position to look at your own drawbacks and not get ensnared in all the stories and back and forth recriminations that usually build up when you notice you've been doing something unskillful. That's because you now realize you don't have to identify with those things. They're just there. Causes have created them, and when the causes are removed they'll go away. Of course, one of the big causes that keeps these things going is that you're paying attention to them. You want to get involved in them. So you learn how not to pay attention to them. You starve them. Then all these distractions and other things that pull you away from centering in on the mind don't have a foundation. They slip away, slip away. Part of the mind will say that you're missing out on something important, but although it's true that there's a lot in the world that you're missing, you're not really missing anything important if you haven't taken care of the mind RST. This is your top responsibility. You can't put it OA to when you're old. You can't put it OA to weekends or to next year's retreat. You've got to deal with it every day, because the mind can create trouble every day. So you've got to keep riding herd on it. But riding herd doesn't mean that you're harassing it or causing it to sewer. You're actually giving it a sense of well-being and learning how to protect it, how to foster a sense of its value. This is where all our goodness comes from. This is where the potential for the end of sewering comes from. The sewering that we're creating with our minds, right now, is the problem. So you've got to solve the problem where the cause is. And it turns out that in the midst of this cause there's something that's deathless. Only it doesn't lie in the midst of things. It's a dire dimension. It's out of space and time. But it's contacted right here. The Buddha doesn't talk much about it. He says it's something you realize by doing the practice. We were talking today about trying to get our heads around the idea of what this deathlessness might be like. But it's not something you get your head around. You try to get your head around sewering so you can comprehend it to the point where you can develop dispassion for the things that make you cling to it. As for the cause of sewering, you try to get your head around it enough to abandon it. But the end of sewering, the cessation of sewering, is not something to comprehend. You discover it. It's there. And regardless of how wonderful your theories are about it or how accurate your ideas may be about it, there's no way they can touch the actual reality of this potential, this dimension. But we can talk about developing the path, using the strength we gain from concentration to look into the ways in which we're causing sewering, and learning how to abandon them. We do this by looking into the most paradoxical habit of the mind, which is that it likes to create sewering. We don't understand why this is happening. We want happiness, we want pleasure, and yet the things we do end up creating so much sewering. We're attached to things that are causing sewering because we don't see the connection, or if we see the connection, we don't think there's any alternative. So when the Buddha talks about the path, it's to remind us that there are alternatives. Good ones. And when he does talk about the cessation of sewering, he tells us enough to let us know that it's really there, and it's really good, and it's really worth going for. It's much better than all the other ideas we have about who we are or how great or important we are, or how horrible we are. All these stories where, whether we think we're good or bad, we're making ourselves the hero, we're making ourselves the heroine, none of which are helpful. You need to look into the state of your mind right now. How is it dealing with itself? How is it dealing with its thoughts? Its cravings? How is it dealing with the good parts of the mind? What is it doing to maintain them, to give them importance? Those are the questions you really want to ask, and those are the ones you want to focus on answering. Because by focusing on them, you can end something really good in the mind. When you've got that real goodness, then you don't have to create all the artificial forms of goodness that we build around ourselves, our self-image, our idea of how important we are in this way or that. This then gets reacted in the way we're generous. The Buddha talks about how the different levels of generosity that come along as we're practicing get higher and higher until finally we get to the state of awakening. Then generosity is just a natural ornament of the mind. In other words, the goodness we do for other people at that point isn't done because we want something out of them, or because we want something out of being good. When the mind has taken care of all of its needs, when it's taken care of all of its inner responsibilities, then everything that's left is a pure gift. This is why your state of mind, should take priority. As for anything that gets in the way, anything that distracts you from this, you've got to put it aside for the time being. It's like learning a musical instrument. You have to be willing to go and practice for hours and hours and hours by yourself. You're not playing for anybody else. It may sound like you're being selfish, but no, you're learning how to get really good at what you're doing, so that when the time comes and you actually do go out on the stage, you've got something good to offer. You've got something good for people to listen to. Like the Buddha. He left his family, and many people get upset about that, thinking he was a deadbeat dad. But you have to remember that one of the ways that a husband or father could provide for his family in those days was to go out on an expedition, go out exploring, and to come back with a treasure. Sometimes it would take years. In this case, the Buddha came back with a really great treasure. The treasure of the deathless. So even though he had to isolate himself from his family and it did cause them some grief, he himself found it hard to leave them still. He knew that he had to. And when he came back, he had something that more than compensated for those 6 or 7 years. So remember this when you that the demands of the practice pull you away from your family or your friends. It may look like you're being irresponsible, but you're actually taking care of your number one responsibility. And when you do that, everybody being TS. Whether anybody else appreciates that fact doesn't matter. You know that this is what you've got to do. A meditator is a good friend to have. April 16, 2012. Take some long deep in and out breaths. Have the sense that the breath is sweeping through your whole body, from the top of the head down to the tips of your toes. Try to notice where there are any patterns of tension in the body. Allow them to relax and let the breath sweep right through them. Then allow the breath to end a rhythm that feels really comfortable. You can experiment for a while to see what kind of breathing feels most refreshing. Sometimes shorter breathing is what the body needs, sometimes longer, sometimes deeper, more shallow, heavier or lighter, faster or slower. Try to keep on top of whatever the body needs. As for any other thoughts that may come into your awareness, just let them go. We're trying to sensitize ourselves to what's going on in the body and to how the breath can help. It's an area of our awareness that we tend to ignore because we're too interested with things outside to notice what we're doing inside. When they talk about things being unconscious or subconscious, it's not that there's a basement in the mind where whatever happens has to be unconscious and in the dark. It's simply that we're not paying attention. Thoughts go eating through the mind and then leave an imprint on the body. Or events in the body can have an impact on the mind. All too often, if we're not aware of this, the tension builds up and results in a sense of being burdened, being weighed down. The Buddha's essential insight is that much of that being burdened or weighed down is totally unnecessary. In fact, none of it is necessary. There may be stress in the body, but it doesn't need to have an impact on the mind. As the Buddha says, when people are in physical pain, It's as if they were shot by an arrow. And then they shoot themselves again with another arrow. The sense of being burdened or victimized by the pain. That image has always struck me as a little too weak. We don't shoot ourselves with just one extra arrow. We shoot ourselves with many more arrows, a whole quiver of arrows. And of course the act of shooting ourselves with those arrows makes the original pain even worse, to say nothing of all the pain of the extra arrows. So no wonder we feel burdened all the time. No wonder we feel victimized, or at the very least that something is wrong. So what we do when we meditate is that, instead of looking for the answer outside, we look for the answer inside. What are we doing here that's adding all that unnecessary pain? This is not a cell-sh question. If you can stop adding that extra pain to your own mind, you're less burdened. And you're less of a burden on others. You can actually start paying attention to how other people are getting along. This part of the practice tends to be underappreciated, but meditators are really good friends to have, precisely because they've learned how not to weigh themselves down all the time. When they're not weighed down, they can actually be of more help to others. When pain comes along, whether it's physical or mental, they realize that they don't have to take it personally. There's a passage in the canon where the monks are talking, and one of them, Sariputta, says, "You know, I was thinking today. Is there anything in the world whose change would cause me grief? I couldn't think of anything at all." And then Ananda, another one of the monks, says, "But what if something happened to the Buddha? Wouldn't that cause you grief?" And Sariputta replies, "No, I'd react on the fact that he was a great human being and had been very helpful to many, and it's a sad thing he couldn't live on. But I wouldn't feel any personal grief around that." And Ananda says, "That's a sign that your conceit is gone." Conceit here meaning not necessarily pride or arrogance, but more a sense of who you are and how you take things personally. If you can be in a difficult situation and not take the loss or change personally, you're actually more helpful to others than you would be otherwise. I've seen many cases where people are crying over someone who is about to die. And a lot of the crying has to do with how much they're going to miss that person, how much grief they feel. That's not all that helpful to the person who's dying. The best gift you can give to someone else who is in trouble is that you've taken care of your habit of personalizing the grief. Of focusing on how much you're going to feel the loss, how much you're going to feel deprived. Once you've gotten past those issues, you can look more carefully. What does this person need? How can I be of help? We were talking today about helping someone who's dying. The thing the Buddha said is to try to make sure that the person isn't worried. There are two cases in the canon. One is of a woman whose husband seems to be on his deathbed. So she goes and tells him, "Don't worry about me. I'll be able to take care of myself when you're gone. Don't worry about my financial situation. Don't worry about my turning away from the Dhamma. In fact, I'll be going to the monastery even more now. So put your mind at rest." And it turns out that the husband doesn't die, at least not then. He recovers and he goes to tell the Buddha what his wife told him. The Buddha replies, "Do you realize how fortunate you are that you have such a wise wife who has your best interest in mind?" There's a similar case where one of the Buddha's cousins, Mahanama, learns that the Buddha's going to go away at the end of the rains retreat. So he asks the Buddha what to do, what to say, if anybody is dying while he's gone. What should I tell him? And the Buddha says, the thing to tell him is to not worry about his family. Regardless of the situation, the fact that you're worried now isn't going to help anybody. So drop those thoughts from your mind. But the Buddha doesn't just leave the person there. He then tells Mahanama to ask, "Are you worried also about the sensual pleasures you're going to be leaving?" If the person says yes, then Mahanama should say, "Try to set your mind on higher levels of being where the sensual pleasures are more rened." In this way, he should keep advising the person to take his thoughts all the way through even higher and higher levels, until he gets to the Brahma world, where the pleasure is the same pleasure we gain from a really concentrated mind. If the person can keep that up, then the Buddha says to tell him to let go even of that type of pleasure. That, too, is impermanent. The sense of identity you would build around that is impermanent, too. Let go of it. If the person can follow you all that way, then he or she can gain total release from all kinds of suffering. That's a huge gift you can give to someone who's dying. It's not always the case that the person dying can follow you that far. It generally would require someone who's got a good meditative background, but you never know. Still, your RST duty always is to try to pull that person away from any worries, and then advise them to set their minds on something good. It could be the good things they've done in the past, which doesn't mean the good times they've had, because that gets people sentimental, and that can get them really upset. Instead, have them think about the times they were generous, the times they were virtuous. If they have any meditative background, try to remind them of that. Give them something good to hold on to. This means that you're not putting your own sense of loss in the way of really helping them. This is why a meditator can be a really good friend. Someone who really is concerned with your welfare, who is not only thinking of his or her own sense of loss or sense of pain, and who is not being burdened by those extra arrows. In my own case, many of the people in my family wondered what good it was to have a monk in the family. But then one year my father went through a severe depression. I was in Thailand and only after several months was I able to make my way back home. Within a couple of weeks, after talking to my father and letting him talk, he was out of the depression. This was after my brothers had been trying for months to help him. That's when one of my brothers said, "You know, it really is good to have a Buddhist monk in the family." Of course, you don't have to be a monk. Anyone who has trained his or her own mind is a good person to have in the family, a good person to have as a friend. So as you're meditating here, remind yourselves, it's not just for us that we're doing this. We're doing this so we can also be a help to others. The less we burden ourselves with our own sufferings, the stronger we'll be. If we're not carrying huge loads around, then when we ND somebody else carrying a heavy load, we have free hands to help them put their burden down. In that way, your training in good friendship can continue. As the Buddha says, you try to look for good friends, people you can rely on, not only so that you can gain their help, but also so that you can learn from them what it means to be a good friend. In that way you can pass on the gift. Strengthening conviction. January 1, 2012. Meditating, strengthening the mind, is very similar to strengthening the body. You have some strength to begin with, and you use that strength to develop further strength. In Thai, the word for exercising is ok kamlang, which means to put forth energy. And in putting it forth, you gain something in return. So as you meditate, you have to use what strengths you already have, if you're going to gain further strength. There are these strengths altogether in the standard list: conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. The fact that conviction comes RST shows that it's important. As one of my teachers in Thailand once said, you notice that the list leading up to discernment doesn't start with concepts or ideas. It starts with conviction. Discernment comes from conviction, provided, of course, that it's conviction in the right things. Traditionally, this means conviction in the Buddha's awakening, that it's not just one of those facts out there in history. It's a fact with implications for what you're doing right here and right now. The idea that someone, through his ears, could ND true happiness. And his ability to ND that happiness was based on the qualities of mind that were not peculiar to him. They're qualities that we all have, to at least some extent, in a potential form. The implication there, of course, is that if he can do it, you can do it, too. Because he found this way and was expert in gaining that freedom, you treat his words the way you would treat an expert's words. Not necessarily something that you're forced to believe, you simply trust that because he knew what he was doing, his explanations of how to do it deserve some special respect. So there are a lot of implications to having conviction in the Buddha's awakening. And, of course, there's going to be a part of the mind that resists this. After all, his story could be just one of those many stories that come from the past, and we've heard lots of those, and maybe it wasn't transmitted properly. Maybe the principles that he said were universal actually applied only in his culture. There are lots of ways that we can develop doubts and uncertainty about the path. So let's look at how the Buddha said to deal with uncertainty. First, of course, you ask yourself, what are you being asked to believe? You're being asked to believe that your actions have an impact. That the quality of the mind with which you act is going to have an impact on the results of that action. That it's possible to learn from your mistakes. And that you do have freedom of choice. These are all fairly commonsensical propositions. Where the Buddha is asking you to take this a little bit further than normal common sense, of course, is that by following this principle, you can go all the way to true happiness, a happiness that won't change. The RST principle, that your actions have an impact, is very easy to accept. That's why we act to begin with. Still, though, it's interesting. There's part of the mind that, many times, would rather that its actions not have results, especially when you know you're doing something unskillful. So you have to ask yourself, what is the state of mind that would want to doubt these things? Is it a state of mind that you can trust? Sometimes that state of mind is just a matter of your own dilemmas. Your own greed, your own aversion, your own laziness, your own delusion. Sometimes those attitudes are fortified by ideas we've picked up from our culture. There's an awful lot in Western culture that goes against the Dhamma. It teaches you that greed is good, that true happiness is impossible, that the happiness that can be bought is good enough. It teaches you that if you don't follow your sensual desires, you'll end up twisted and mentally unbalanced. There's a lot in Western culture that feeds on our greed, aversion, and delusion, that encourages our greed, aversion, and delusion. Like that cartoon in the New Yorker several years ago. A man is standing in front of a magazine rack, and the names of the magazines are all the 7 deadly sins. Or like the billboard that used to be on I-15 North. Las Vegas 7 deadly sins, one convenient location. Our culture encourages these things. So when you start to have doubts about the practice or become uncertain about the practice, you have to ask yourself, whose values are speaking? And what's the quality of the mind that's speaking here? You want to step back from these things. It's not that you don't listen to your doubts at all, but you do want to gure out which doubts are coming from honest uncertainty, and which are coming from other agendas. Which of these voices do you want to identify with? Of course, there's the simple doubt of not knowing. But you also have to realize that if you wait for true knowledge, absolute, certain knowledge to come to you on a platter, you're going to die RST. We live in a world of uncertainties. We have to take gambles as to what it will be worth expending to get a reward in terms of pleasure, well-being, satisfaction that's commensurate with the effort we put in. This is a part of human life that makes us uncomfortable. Most of us don't like to think about how much we're taking on faith as we go through the day. Even just believing that the world is going to go on as it has been. There's no guarantee. You have to realize that there's always going to be an element of uncertainty as you make choices in life. This is where you have to balance what seems to be a safe choice as opposed to an unsafe one, a likely choice as opposed to an unlikely one, a noble choice as opposed to an ignoble one. When you look at the Buddha's teachings, they tee all the right criteria. They're safe, noble, and likely. It's likely, for example, there is a pattern to the principle of cause and effect. Even if it doesn't work out that is the way things are, when you follow the Buddha's instructions for exploring this issue, you've developed good qualities in the present moment. There's a certain sense of satisfaction coming from that, a certain sense of nobility that you've acted on your higher impulses, rather than on your lower ones. So you have to be willing to commit to some things before you learn any undeniable truth. This is a principle that Ajahn Lee repeats over and over again. That you have to be true in order to end truth. You have to say, I'm really going to give myself to this particular course of action, this particular way of approaching life, and then see what comes out as a result. You have to give it time, you have to give it energy. Without expending the energy, you're not going to get the strength of conviction in return. And so you look around. Who are the people who followed this path in the past? In my own case, one of the things that really convinced me that this is something worth looking into is meeting Ajahn Fuang. I remember when I had learned about Buddhism, the idea that someone could practice to be free of greed, aversion, and delusion sounded like practicing to be a dead person. It didn't sound attractive at all. But then, in meeting Ajahn Fuang, I met someone who had devoted his life to the path. He was very alive, very alert, very wise. He inspired a lot of trust. And as he said, this wasn't how he had started in life. He said he owed it all to the training. I compared him to the other people I'd known, other possible ways I could live my life, and his seemed the most likely to show good results. It was a risk with a lot of uncertainties, but I felt inspired by his example. This is why it's good to read the stories of the Ajahns, people in the recent past who have given their lives to the practice. Sometimes it's easier to relate to people who live closer to us in time, although, if you read the Theragatha and Theragatha, you realize that the problems people face in training their minds are not so different now from what they were back around the Buddha's time. So you look at the life of those who have practiced, and then you give it a good try. Notice which qualities of the mind the Buddha says are unskillful, which are skillful. Learn to recognize the skillful ones, recognize the unskillful ones in your own mind, so you can develop skillful ones and abandon the unskillful ones, and see what happens. This is not the sort of thing that you just try on weekends. You ask yourself, if you don't give yourself to this kind of life, this kind of practice, this kind of belief, what kind of belief are you giving yourself to? What habits are you training yourself in? We don't usually think about that. We just live our ordinary lives and don't particularly think of it as a training in any way. But maybe we're training ourselves in laziness or complacency. Maybe we're training ourselves in an unwillingness to commit. Is that something you want to train in? What it comes down to is the fact that we're always making choices. All too often we don't really realize what we're choosing. So at the very least, this question, do you want to place your faith in the Buddha's awakening? Forces you to realize that you already are making choices, you already are training the mind in one direction or another. Then the question becomes, is it the direction that you want to go? What kind of hope does that direction hold out? The Buddha's direction holds out the hope that maybe there really is a true happiness that's not dependent on conditions, that's not going to leave you because of aging, illness, or death. If you want to end out, if that is a genuine possibility, there's only one way to do it. Do whatever the path requires. That's the only way you're going to know. So do you want to know this? Whether this is true or not? That's what it comes down to. Or are there other things you'd rather know? Things that strike you as more important? More desirable? That's the kind of question we all have to ask ourselves. The problem is that, all too often, we pretend that the question has already been answered without our having to do anything, without our having to put anything out, to expend any energy or any effort. But we're always putting energy into something. Why not put it into something that holds out the promise of something special? This is one way of overcoming your doubts. Seeing when you put energy into something and asking yourself what kind of results you're getting. Are they the kind of results that you want? Are they commensurate with the energy you're putting into them? What kind of happiness would really satisfy you? What vision would you like to have for the possibilities of human life? If it includes the possibility of a true happiness, then this is the path that works. If you just listen to the words, you won't know. But this is the path that provides that possibility. And it's up to you to decide whether you want to test it or not, keeping in mind Ajahn Lee's words. That it's through being true that we end the truth. Generating energy. January 2nd, 2012. In Thailand they sometimes compare practicing meditation to ying a kite. It takes a fair amount of air to get the kite up in the air, until it nearly catches the wind, but then it doesn't take much air anymore. The energy of the practice, at that point, keeps feeding itself. Now, in Thai, the phrase catching the wind is actually a play on words. Because the word for wind and the word for breath are the same word, lam. So when you practice, when you nearly get to the breath, and it feels easiest to stay with the breath, that's when you've caught the wind. The practice picks up its own momentum. The tricky part, of course, is getting the kite up into the air, getting to the point where the energy you put into the practice gets less and less, and the practice itself produces the energy you need. It's something you'll need at various stages in the practice. It doesn't simply happen once and for all that you catch the wind and then have no more problems. Sometimes the kites will fall down, and you have to get them back up in the air. So it's good to know some ways of generating energy so that you'll be able to get things up in the air, to catch the wind again. When the Buddha discusses persistence in the V-strengths, it builds on conviction. That's one of the mental ways of giving rise to more energy. Another is in the context of the 7 factors for awakening, where persistence builds on mindfulness, keeping something in mind. So what are the ways of giving rise to conviction that are going to energize you, and what are the things you have to keep in mind that will give rise to more energy? In the 7 factors for awakening, the Buddha talks about qualities that act as a foothold for the energy or the potential for energy, but then he doesn't explain what they are. This is where you have to look around in yourself. This is also where you have to learn from others. That's the part you have to keep in mind. It essentially comes down to 2 sorts of sources. Sources within the mind and sources within the body. In terms of the body, you may want to look at the way you're breathing, because there are some very peaceful and calm ways of breathing that actually deplete the energy in your body. So if you find that your energy level is low, what can you do to change the way you breathe? Try to notice which parts of the body seem to be overworked, the ones that are doing all the work in the breathing, but don't seem to be getting any refreshment from the breath. Consciously relax those parts and say, if the body is going to breathe in, other parts will have to take over, but these parts are going to stay relaxed, regardless. And you find that other parts of the body will pitch in. Watch that for a while. See if the way they're breathing actually does improve the energy in the body. Sometimes you have to remind yourself that the body is, as you directly experience it from within, all breath. Whatever sensation comes up, think of it as an aspect of breath energy, and then ask yourself, is that healthy breath energy or not? If it were healthy, what would it feel like? Because sometimes you hold in mind the perception that a sensation is solid, and you put up with all kinds of stew from solidity that you wouldn't put up with if you thought this was breath. Then conversely, there are times when you feel a need for something really solid and grounding to get your energy going. So you have to play with your perceptions here to see which perceptions of what's going on in the body can actually be helpful. There are parts of the body that you may be suppressing that could actually be a source of energy. Ajahn Lee talks of the breath that goes up the spine and the breath that goes up the centerline in the front of the torso. Do you have any room for that kind of breath energy in your concept of the way you breathe? Or do you squash it? Or when you're feeling tired, which parts of the body are you focusing on as feeling tired? Then check to see which parts are actually okay. Switch your perception around to the parts that are okay. See what that does. In other words, realize that there are pockets of energy in the body and not just in the body, all around you. Ajahn Lee talks about the elements that surround the body and can give nourishment to it. Sometimes these elements can come into the dhyana chakras, or the dhyana resting points of the breath, as Ajahn Lee calls them. Think of an energy outside the body coming in and nourishing the point in the middle of the chest, nourishing the point in the middle of your head, any point that seems to need extra energy. Tap into the energies around you. There are some good ones. Learn how to recognize the good ones that feel refreshing as soon as you allow them in. So there are potentials there that you may not have thought about. And it's good to remember that there are those possibilities there. That's what mindfulness is for. As for energy that comes from the mind, the Buddha talks about gladdening the mind. Thinking about topics that give rise to a sense of inspiration. These can be the Buddha, the Dhamma, or the Sangha, your own generosity, your own virtue. Sometimes putting the breath aside for the time being and thinking about these things can be very helpful. Thinking about the Sangha, for instance. Think about all the ajahns and the success they had in the practice. Remember that they were human beings, you're a human being. They could do it, you can do it. This is the message they always give. One of the purposes of this is to dig out any attitudes you may be holding that are actually harmful, that actually sap your energy, such as the attitude that I probably won't be able to get anywhere in this lifetime. I'll just muddle around a little bit, and I hope that things will go better next time around. Ask yourself if part of your mind is holding on to that. And why would it want to hold on to that? It might be that it doesn't want to put out too much effort, or you don't want to set the bar too high. But what you're doing is you set the bar low, as beating yourself down with the bar. If you're more open to the possibility that, yes, you could attain one of the noble attainments in this lifetime, does that energize you? Does it scare you? Look into that. Another contemplation that can give rise to energy is the contemplation of death. Realizing that you don't know when death is going to come, or how it's going to come. All these prophecies have been floating around about the year 2012, the end of the world, the reverse of the magnetic poles, or whatever. But you may not even live to see the end of the world. Something might happen before then. This is not meant to get you depressed. It's meant to motivate you to realize that important things need to be done in the mind right now. If aging, illness and death come, or, rather, when they come, what qualities of mind are you going to need? You see some people as they approach death, and they just get totally thrown off balance. They can't even allow themselves to think about the future, for the future holds nothing but an empty blank for them. And if they had a bad past, that's something they don't want to think about either. I think this is one of the reasons that dementia often areas up as death approaches. You don't know where to focus your mind. Well, if you have a meditation practice, you know you can focus right here at the breath. Maintain this awareness of the present moment so that the mind doesn't go ailing around. You're going to need mindfulness, you're going to need alertness, you're going to need as much concentration and discernment as you can muster. And when are you going to develop those qualities if you don't develop them now? Right now is an ideal opportunity. You're sitting here meditating. It's quiet around you. One of the contemplations the Buddha has the monks react on, and it's one of the ones King Asoka recommended in one of his edicts, is to think about future dangers. Aging, illness, and death can come, social unrest can come, a split in the Sangha can come. If you tell yourself, well, I'll just wait until my next lifetime, he warns that the Dhamma and the Vinaya are going to deteriorate over time. The opportunities don't get better. They get worse. So you make use of the opportunities you have now. In this case, you're motivating yourself with a little bit of fear. The wise kind of fear, the fear that's related to compunction and heedfulness. So it's up to you to observe what you need to think about to motivate yourself to practice. Sometimes you need the positive side of the encouragement, so you hold out a carrot. But sometimes you need the stick to remind yourself that if you don't do the work now, it's not going to get easier. They've done studies of people who are really expert in physical skills, and they've discovered that these people have the ability to motivate themselves using both types of motivation. A strong sense of the harm that can be done if you don't master the skill, and a strong sense of the benefits that can come when you do. So you have to learn how to deal with your own mind, and when one method of motivation isn't working, remember you've got other possibilities, other choices, other tools in your kit. What it comes down to is that you try to find sources of energy in the body, and sources of energy in the way you think, that you can then channel into your mindfulness, alertness, and concentration, that give more ardency to the practice, so that the kite can get up in the air. Ideally, when your energy turns into right effort, one of the results is rapture. Refreshment, a sense of well-being that then becomes food for the concentration. This is when the kite nearly catches the wind. You're focused on the breath in the way that gives rise to a sense of fullness, and then you feed off of that, so that you can stay with it more consistently, with a greater sense of solidity, stability. So remember that right effort is not just a matter of brute force. It requires your ingenuity and your intelligence, your ability to ND sources of energy that you've overlooked or that you've been squashing. Look at the way you think, look at the way you breathe, look at the way you hold your body. See if there's anything you can change. Any ways of thinking that are keeping you down, learn to question them. Any ways of breathing that are stymieing your energy, just drop them. Ask yourself, which parts of the body are getting starved of energy? Where is some energy in another part of the body that can help nourish them? If it can't be found in the body, remind yourself there's energy around the body, so tap into that. This is what mindfulness is good for. To remember that you've got these potential sources. Don't forget them. The skill lies in learning how to put them to use, so that the kite gets up into the wind, and the energy can feed on itself to keep the practice going, making it steadier and more reliable, with mindfulness feeding your persistence, and persistence feeding your mindfulness. That way, both of them do become what they call dominant factors in the mind. Success by approximation. September 30, 2013. When the Buddha taught the path, he said it leads to awakening, it leads to nibbana. But he didn't list awakening or nibbana as one of the factors of the path. The goal is one thing, the path is something else. That's why he used the image of a path. And unlike the relationship between craving and sewering, the path isn't the cause or the origination of the goal. It simply leads you there. These points are important to keep in mind because all too often there's a tendency to think that you can get to awakening by cloning it. But awakening isn't something you can clone. Instead, the Buddha has you think strategically. What actions can you do to bring yourself to the point where you arrive at awakening? They're very different from the awakening itself. There are some similarities. Concentration is very calm, wisdom is very clear, virtue can be pure. But their calm, clarity, and purity are all fabricated, whereas the calm, clarity, and purity of the goal are on another level altogether. You get there not by imitating the goal, you get there through a process of approximation. Even though awakening can happen in a moment, and you're awakening to something that's potentially right here in the present moment, you still have to develop your discernment to detect these things, and that takes time. You have to develop your skill. As with any skill, it's going to go through levels of refinement. And it includes factors that are very different from the goal, things like the desire of right eart, which entails wanting to do things skillfully. And even though we're here to get rid of aversion, there has to be a certain amount of aversion, too. To begin with, you have to be averse toward the results of unskillful behavior. That aversion will eventually have to get honed down. But just because it's there doesn't mean that you're going in the wrong direction. You're learning how to approximate things. It's as if we're digging for gold underground. You don't dig for gold with a gold shovel, you use an iron shovel or a steel one. Or it's like trying to get fresh water out of salt water. The salt water may be cool, and you want cool fresh water when you drink it. But you don't go straight from cool salt water to the cool fresh water. You have to take it through heat RST, you heat the water and distill it. Then it can cool down again. So there are parts of the path where you really have to put in energy, and that's going to require desire. You're making concentration. Creating a state of concentration in the mind. You're creating a state of becoming, in which you take on the identity of someone doing concentration in the world of the mind. That, too, requires desire. It's simply a matter of learning how to renew your sensitivity as to what's skillful and what's not. Which kinds of desires are skillful, and which kinds of desires are not. Which kinds of skillful qualities are appropriate for one particular situation, and which ones are appropriate for another. Remember the teaching on the 7 factors for awakening. The factor of mindfulness is always useful, but the other factors are meant to be emphasized at some times and not at others. The calming ones are useful for when the mind is feeling frenetic, the energizing ones, for when the mind is feeling sluggish. So even with skillful qualities, you have to learn how to make distinctions. Beyond that, there are levels of concentration, levels of equanimity, levels of right view. These things will progress as you go on the path, until the mind is totally free of passion and aversion. But to get there, you have to be passionate about the path. And your initial motivation may have a bit of aversion in it. You're averse to soaring. That's nah. You read about some of the Ajahns in Thailand talking about how they used some fairly unskillful mind states to deal with other unskillful mind states. Now, as Ben Ananda once pointed out, some unskillful mind states are totally useless on the path. Sexual desire is one that's totally out the path. As he said, the Buddha cut the bridge to that one, it plays no role on the path at all. Sensual passion of any sort doesn't play any role on the path. But there are other things related to conceit and craving that are necessary. You have to want the goal, and you have to have the confidence you're good enough to do it. Now conceit and craving bring with them some unskillful side effects, and as the path goes on, you're going to pare those down. But if you've got them, learn how to use them in a proper way. Ajahn Lee tells of how, when he was a young monk, he would get into meditation contests with the other monks to see who could sit the longest or do walking meditation the longest. And even though it was fairly childish, it still taught him some important lessons on how to sit and walk for long periods of time. It taught him patience and endurance. Other Ajahns talk about getting angry at their dilemmas, and that's perfectly nah. As you get more skilled, you begin to see where the anger is unnecessary, and then you can drop it. But don't get waylaid by the type of thinking that criticizes you for being awfully passionate about your practice, or awfully attached to concentration, or awfully negative about a person you don't want to associate with. Well, if you realize that associating with that kind of person is going to take you over the path, you've got to be careful. Heedfulness requires that you learn to be wary. We're often taught that the Dhamma is all about trusting. And it's true that you have to learn how to trust the Buddha and trust your desire for true happiness. But there are things you have to be wary of, both inside and out. I mean, that's what heedfulness means. So we're not being unkind when we decide that certain relationships have to be put on hold. And we haven't wandered too far over the path if we decide that we really are sick and tired of having our sensual desires take us over, and we want something better than that. That's how you motivate yourself. So there are times when you use unskillful qualities to get rid of other unskillful qualities. Then, gradually, things will get more and more renewed. Especially as the path picks up momentum. The concentration itself becomes your motivation. The mindfulness becomes your motivation. Your insight becomes your motivation. All this is achieved by success through approximation. So as Ajahn Lee points out in his talk on the various demons of delement, some of them have their uses. You're a tur as you meditate, and some of the most intelligent turs are the ones who not only beat the enemy, but can also actually convert the enemy to their side. You do have to be wary about these things. But as long as you're alert, you're heading in the right direction. After all, even good things have their dangers. Too much equanimity can be bad for your practice. The trick lies in learning how to deal effectively with whatever comes up. Knowing the danger and learning how to avoid the danger, you can learn to put a lot of things to use that would otherwise be denied to you. If you're sitting here trying to clone awakening, desire is denied to you. Craving, conceit, all those things are denied to you, and it means you're trying to follow the path without all the means needed for progress. There's a kind of dilemma that tells you, here you are trying to be peaceful, so why are you angry at your dilemmas? That's dilemma taking on the guise of Dhamma. You have to be very careful about that. So have your wits about you, look at things from all sides, and that's what will see you through. In harmony with the Buddha's guidance, we stress the immense importance of sharing wisdom expansively. Presently, we've transformed this extensive 1,000-page work into a readily accessible audio format. The duty to advance this noble cause now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the widespread dissemination of these teachings, benefiting numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of knowledge sharing and the cultivation of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We extend an invitation for you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can bring profound positive change to the lives of many.